On the morning of March 18, 2026, thousands of system administrators, IT managers, and longtime Linux power users opened their update logs and froze. Somewhere between a routine dependency check and a scheduled upgrade window, machines running rolling release distributions. Like Arch Linux and Manjaro pulled down a package that quietly rewrote the rules of the desktop they had been running for years. GNOME shell restarted. Mutter, the window compositor, restarted with it. And when GDM, the login manager, came back up, something was missing. The X11 session option was gone, not grayed out, not hidden behind a settings flag. Gone, structurally, from the code itself. For a certain category of user, the kind running specialized remote access tools, legacy scientific computing software, or enterprise screen sharing platforms that assumed a full X11 session would always be there. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a 5-alarm fire. Support forums lit up within hours. Reddit threads filled with people asking whether their entire workflow had just been broken overnight without warning. And the panic was not misplaced because, after more than 3 decades of coexistence, GNOME had just severed its relationship with the display server protocol that had defined the Linux desktop since before most of its current users were born. This was the moment GNOME 50, codenamed Tokyo, arrived, and whether you felt it as a shock or as a long overdue liberation depended entirely on which side of that transition you were standing on. To understand why this single release generated so much noise, you have to understand what came before it. GNOME's version numbering changed back in 2021 when the project abandoned the old 3.x scheme and started releasing on a simple sequential count, one major version roughly every 6 months. 40, 41, 42, and onward. That means GNOME 50 is a milestone by pure arithmetic, the 50th major release of a desktop environment that has been evolving since 1999. But the number landing exactly when it did was not just a coincidence of scheduling. It arrived at a point where a decade's worth of unfinished architectural work, the slow, painful, often mocked transition away from the aging X11 display server toward the modern Wayland protocol, finally reached a level of maturity where the GNOME project felt confident enough to cut the cord entirely. The name itself, Tokyo, is a tribute to the local organizers of the GNOME Asia Summit held in Japan in 2025. And there's something almost poetic about a release defined by precision engineering being named after a city famous for exactly that. Let's be precise about what actually happened, because the initial panic online overstated some of it. GNOME shell, Mutter, and GDM no longer contain the code needed to start a full X11 session. You cannot log in through GDM and choose X11 as your display protocol for a GNOME session anymore. That option has been removed. But GNOME 50 still ships with X-Wayland, the compatibility layer that lets individual X11 applications run inside a Wayland session. So if you have an older application that was never rebuilt for Wayland, it still opens, still runs, still functions largely as expected. What's gone is the underlying X11 session itself, the full environment that some legacy tools, screen recorders, and remote access configurations were built to assume would always exist. For the vast majority of desktop users, this distinction barely registers in daily use. For a smaller, more specialized slice of the Linux population working in enterprise IT, scientific computing labs, or certain remote administration setups, it means real friction and, in some cases, a forced migration to different tooling or a different desktop environment altogether that still offers a full X11 session as an option. GNOME has made its position unambiguous. It is not maintaining X11 session support indefinitely to accommodate edge cases, and that is a deliberate, calculated decision rather than an oversight. Here's why that decision matters far beyond ideology. X11 was not just an old protocol sitting quietly in the background. It was an active technical ceiling. It made modern display technologies, adaptive refresh rates, precise fractional scaling, reliable color management, unreliable at best and flatly impossible at worst, without a pile of distro-specific patches and manual workarounds that only the most dedicated tinkerers would ever bother applying. Removing X11 as an option wasn't an act of abandoning the past for its own sake. It was clearing the ceiling so the features built directly on top of Wayland could finally stabilize. And GNOME 50 is the proof, not a roadmap promise, not an experimental flag buried in developer settings, but a shipping, installable, production-ready desktop that people are running on real hardware right now. Rolling release users on Arch and Manjaro had it the day it launched. Fedora Workstation 44 ships it as the default desktop. And critically, Ubuntu 26 Auras for LTS, arriving in April 2026, brings it to the long-term support audience, the release channel that enterprises, schools, government institutions, and millions of cautious everyday users actually adopt and then leave untouched for years. When GNOME 50 lands in an LTS release, it stops being an experiment for enthusiasts. It becomes the default first impression of Linux for an enormous population of people who have never touched the operating system before. Now, let's talk about what actually changed for the person sitting in front of the screen, because this is where GNOME 50 stops being an architecture story and starts being a genuinely exciting desktop story. Variable refresh rate, VRR, has technically existed in GNOME for a while, but calling it usable before this release would be generous. You had to dig into G settings through the terminal, hope your distro had applied the right patches, and even then, the behavior varied wildly depending on your GPU and monitor combination. It was the kind of feature that existed on paper but required treating your desktop like a weekend engineering project to actually enjoy. GNOME 50 changes that completely. VRR is stable, enabled by default on compatible monitors, and requires zero manual configuration. Plug in a display that supports it, boot into GNOME, and it simply works. Your monitor's refresh rate now dynamically tracks whatever your GPU is actually rendering in real time, climbing when you're scrolling or dragging windows around and dropping when the screen is static. The result is a fluidity that a fixed 60, 120, or even 144 Hz panel cannot fully replicate, because the display stays perfectly synchronized to the actual output, rather than forcing a mismatch that causes tearing, or if you enable VSync to fix the tearing, introduces input lag instead. There's a smaller detail buried inside GNOME 50's VRR implementation that deserves more attention than it's gotten, and it's genuinely clever engineering. The mouse cursor now moves independently of whatever frame rate the active application is rendering at. It's called low latency cursor mode, and what it means in practice is that even if an app is only pushing out 40 frames per second, your cursor still tracks at the full maximum refresh rate your monitor supports. On a 144 Hz display, the cursor moves at 144 Hz, no matter what the rest of the screen is doing underneath it. That separation between input responsiveness and rendering load is a small thing on paper, but makes an enormous difference in how alive the desktop feels under your hand. Fractional scaling tells a similar story of finally reaching maturity after years of being technically present, but practically broken. If you own a laptop with a high-resolution 2K or 4K screen, you know the old dilemma. 100% scaling made every element on screen microscopic. 200% scaling blew everything up to a size that felt designed for someone sitting across the room. The sensible middle ground, the 125 and 150% options that actually match the physical size of most modern laptop panels, existed but were flagged as experimental, buried behind deconf settings, GNOME extensions, or distro-level patches that most users never knew to look for. GNOME 50 drops the experimental label entirely. Fractional scaling now sits as a first-class, fully supported option directly inside the display settings panel. No terminal required, no warning label attached. The color management story ties directly into both the display improvements and the remote desktop upgrades. And it's one of the more technically significant pieces of this release, even though it rarely makes headlines. Mutter, GNOME's compositor, now implements version 2 of the Wayland color management protocol, an open, upstream specification rather than a GNOME-only patch, meaning it's interoperable with other compositors and applications following the same standard. In practice, this brings a new SDR native rendering mode that keeps standard dynamic range content color accurate, even when HDR content is running alongside it, along with screen sharing that now preserves HDR metadata instead of stripping it out before the stream reaches whoever's on the other end of your video call. For anyone doing color-sensitive work on Linux, video editing, photo retouching, professional design, this is exactly the kind of low-level infrastructure change that opens the door to workflows that simply weren't reliable before. Then there's the Nvidia situation, which has been one of the single most consistent sources of frustration and forum warfare in the entire Linux ecosystem for years. GNOME 50 includes targeted patches in Mutter addressing explicit synchronization, the mechanism Nvidia's proprietary driver stack needs to run stably under Wayland. What explicit sync fixes is the frame timing mismatch between the compositor and the GPU driver that previously produced stuttering, visual glitches, and general instability whenever Nvidia hardware tried to run a Wayland session. Earlier attempts at solving this introduced their own stability headaches, but by the time GNOME 50 shipped, the implementation had matured into something reliable. Independent benchmarks comparing identical Nvidia setups running GNOME 49 versus GNOME 50 are showing frame rate gains in the range of 10 to 20% in demanding scenarios, with the stuttering that plagued high refresh rate Nvidia configurations on Wayland largely eliminated. This isn't a marketing talking point about Linux finally working on Nvidia hardware. It's a measurable, reproducible performance shift that changes the calculation for anyone who avoided GNOME, specifically because of Nvidia instability. Hardware-accelerated remote desktop rarely gets the spotlight in release coverage, but for people running Linux in professional environments or home labs, it's genuinely transformative. GNOME 50 now offloads video encoding for remote desktop sessions to the GPU using Vulkan and VA API instead of grinding through everything in software on the CPU. The result is dramatically smoother remote sessions, lower latency, reduced CPU load, and remote GNOME desktops that no longer feel like operating through wet cement. High DPI displays now scale correctly in remote sessions automatically. Camera redirection lets you use a local webcam as though it were physically plugged into the remote machine. Kerberos authentication is supported for enterprise environments that require it. On top of that, GNOME 50 introduces a new headless session service that makes it far easier to spin up a graphical session on a machine with no monitor attached at all, a detail that matters enormously for anyone running Linux boxes as remote workstations or cloud desktops. Here's where the story shifts from the display stack to daily lived experience, because the part of this release that gets the least coverage is often the part users notice the most once they're actually sitting down using the thing. GNOME files, the file manager most people still call by its old name, Nautilus, has been a genuine pain point for years. Thumbnail generation crawled. Opening a folder full of high-resolution photos meant staring at a progress bar while previews rendered one agonizing frame at a time. Memory usage crept upward the longer a session ran. GNOME 50 tackles this at the architectural level rather than patching around the symptoms. The file manager now uses the Glycin library for image decoding, a sandboxed, high-performance approach that both accelerates thumbnail rendering significantly and improves security by isolating the decoding process from the rest of the application. Folders that used to take several seconds to fully populate with thumbnails now render almost instantly, and memory usage stays measurably lower across long sessions. There's also a new grid view captions dialog that lets you control exactly what metadata shows underneath icons, a small addition that power users who live inside the file manager will notice and appreciate immediately. The parental controls overhaul is easy to overlook if you don't manage a shared computer or a child's account, but it represents one of the most architecturally significant additions in this entire release. GNOME has technically had some form of parental controls for years, but the implementation was incomplete and inconsistent, never quite matching what a parent or guardian would actually need to meaningfully manage a child's screen time. Funded through a grant from the Endless Foundation, GNOME 50 rebuilds this system from the ground up. For the first time, parents can set actual screen time limits alongside bedtime schedules for child accounts, and when either limit is hit, the system automatically locks the screen. Children see notifications as they approach their limit, and guardians retain the ability to authorize extra time on the spot when it's genuinely needed. The parental controls application itself received a full visual redesign to match the current GNOME aesthetic, and settings now links directly into it, rather than burying it somewhere half-finished. Developers have also quietly laid the back-end groundwork for future web content filtering, with the user-facing interface for that expected in a later release. For families running Linux at home, for schools deploying GNOME across shared lab computers, this is infrastructure that will actually get used precisely because it's finally discoverable and complete. Accessibility received just as much attention, and the redesign of the Orca screen reader goes well beyond a fresh coat of paint. The Preferences window has been completely rebuilt to match modern GNOME design conventions, instead of looking frozen in an earlier decade. All settings are now global by default, eliminating the old headache of having to reconfigure Orca separately for every single application. Automatic language. Switching now works for both web content and native app interfaces, a critical improvement for anyone working across multiple languages day to day. Browse mode has been extended to cover all document content, and sticky mode, which changes how modifier keys behave with Orca's commands, now activates automatically for Electron-based applications that previously demanded manual setup. Braille support has been enhanced, and mouse review, the feature that reads aloud whatever sits under the cursor as it moves, finally works correctly under Wayland sessions. That last point closes a gap accessibility advocates had been documenting for years, one of the clearest remaining differences between X11 and Wayland support. Alongside the Orca work, GNOME 50 introduces a reduced motion toggle in accessibility settings that limits or removes interface animations for anyone who experiences discomfort or dizziness from motion effects, a feature macOS and Windows have offered for years and whose absence in GNOME was a real acknowledged gap. It now takes a single toggle to turn on. The new GNOME Circle applications, shipping alongside this release round, what you can do without reaching outside the ecosystem for third-party tools. Gradia is a screenshot annotation app that goes well beyond drawing an arrow on an image, offering gradient backgrounds, drop shadows, and custom fills that produce the kind of polished output content creators and documentation writers used to need dedicated external software to achieve. Constrict is a video compression tool built around a genuinely smart design choice. Instead of forcing you to manually pick bitrate, resolution, and codec settings, you simply tell it the file size or target you're aiming for, and it calculates the optimal combination automatically. Sessions is a straightforward Pomodoro-style focus timer, and a refreshed Sudoku app now includes conflict highlighting for anyone who wants a quick logic puzzle break. GNOME Calendar picked up the ability to display attendee lists for events, including whether someone's attendance is required or optional, along with ICS export support, and full keyboard navigation using arrow keys in month view. The document viewer, renamed Papers back in GNOME 48, now has a completely reworked annotation sidebar with text tools, drawing tools, line tools, and highlighting, all accessible directly from the main view. Settings itself picked up smaller but genuinely useful additions too, including a first day of the week option under date and time that Calendar and other apps now respect, clearer separation between input and output volume controls, improved detection of discrete GPUs, better handling of external or locked keyboard layout sources in the top bar, and more refined tab focus behavior inside the quick settings menu. None of these are headline features on their own, but together they're the kind of accumulated polish that makes a desktop feel considered rather than assembled. The whole release runs on GTK 422, which brings improved SVG support and gives application developers a stronger toolkit foundation to build on going forward. So here's the real question underneath all of this. Is GNOME 50 the release that finally makes the Linux desktop a serious, no-compromise option for the person who has been sitting on the fence, not the enthusiast, already running Arch and tweaking config files at midnight, not the sysadmin who barely touches a graphical interface, but the ordinary person who switched from Windows 10 last year because Microsoft pushed them off it, or the person who's been quietly curious about Linux for years, but kept bouncing back to Mac OS because the desktop experience felt inconsistent and unfinished. That's the audience GNOME 50 is actually speaking to. And for the first time, the honest answer looks like yes. Think back to what the standard objections to GNOME as a daily driver were even 18 months ago. Screen tearing and stuttering on high refresh monitors. Fractional scaling that felt unreliable on high DPI laptop panels. Nvidia hardware being a coin flip for Wayland stability. Remote desktop sessions that were borderline unusable for real work. A file manager that visibly lagged behind its competitors. Accessibility support that trailed what users coming from other platforms had come to expect. None of those were unfair criticisms. They were accurate descriptions of real limitations that real people ran into the moment they tried to make GNOME their everyday environment. GNOME 50 addresses every one of those categories, not partially, not behind an experimental flag, but in the stable default configuration shipping to users through Ubuntu 26.04 LTS and Fedora Workstation 44. The Ubuntu timing deserves particular emphasis because it changes the scale of what this release actually represents. Ubuntu 26.04. LTS carries 5 years of official support. It's the version enterprises evaluate before deployment, that IT departments roll out across fleets of machines, that cautious everyday users install once and then leave alone for years without a second thought. Anyone installing Ubuntu 26.04 LTS in April 2026 and running it through 2031 is going to have variable refresh rate, fractional scaling, hardware, accelerated remote desktop, and a Wayland-only foundation as their baseline experience from the very first boot. They won't know any of this was ever painful. They won't have the context to appreciate how different this is from GNOME 44 or 46. They'll simply open a laptop with a 2K screen and watch it scale correctly without touching a single setting. That kind of quiet normalization matters enormously for Linux adoption in a way that no individual technical improvement, taken alone, could ever achieve on its own. And the broader timing around this release is not incidental either. Windows 10 reached its end of life in October 2025, a genuine inflection point for the PC market. Hundreds of millions of active Windows 10 users suddenly faced a choice. Buy new hardware capable of running Windows 11, pay for extended security updates, or look elsewhere entirely. A meaningful slice of that population started seriously considering Linux for the first time in their lives, and a large share of them landed on Ubuntu specifically. The version of GNOME those new users are meeting, right at the exact moment they're forming their first impression of what Linux even is GNOME 50. The long-running question of whether the Linux desktop is finally ready for mainstream non-technical users is being answered by a release that happened to land at precisely the right moment in the broader market. None of this means GNOME 50 is flawless, and it's worth being honest about where the friction still lives. The complete removal of X11 sessions is a real problem for a specific slice of users. If your workflow depends on screen-sharing tools built around X11, on remote access configurations that assume a full X11 session, or on specialized professional software in enterprise or scientific computing environments that explicitly requires that session type, rather than simply running as an X11 app through X-Wayland, you are going to hit a wall with this release. X-Wayland handles the vast majority of legacy applications transparently, But there are edge cases, particularly in institutional and scientific settings, where the assumption of a full X11 session runs too deep for Wayland to paper over. Those users are facing a real decision: either shift to a different desktop environment that still offers a full X11 session, or push their tooling vendors to finally build proper Wayland support. GNOME has made its stance on this unmistakably clear, and it is not backing away from it to smooth over legacy friction. If you want to see it for yourself before your distribution officially ships it, the full release notes and changelog are public on release.gnome.org, and you can download a GNOME OS image and try it inside GNOME boxes right now without touching your main system. Rolling release users on Arch and Manjaro have had it since the March 18th release day. Fedora 44 ships it as the default desktop. Ubuntu 26.04. LTS is about to hand it to the largest and most cautious segment of the Linux user base. This is not a roadmap promise sitting somewhere in the future. It is already running on real machines right now across the world. If you evaluated the Linux desktop a year or two ago and walked away because one of these long-standing complaints felt too real to work around, this is genuinely worth a second look. Not because the release is perfect, but because the specific things that made GNOME feel unpolished have been addressed all at once, in a single coordinated release, in a way that hasn't happened quite like this before. GNOME 50, Tokyo, earned its milestone number. And if you've been paying attention to Linux desktop development for any length of time, you already understand exactly what it means when a project gets this many pieces right in the same release, at the same moment a major LTS cycle is about to carry it to millions of people who have never touched a Linux desktop before in their lives. This is the release where GNOME stopped asking to be taken seriously and simply became the kind of desktop that speaks for itself.